When you join Pharma, you have to acknowledge that perfectionism is a productivity killer. One part of the organization that is extremely and has to be extremely obsessed with quality. And the other part, when you join an affiliate, which is basically a marketing company, then you need to work much less and you simply don't get anything done if you nitty-gritty. And you need to put that perfectionism aside. And that can be an arena of conflict at times. When the most classic of all conflicts in this kind of organization is between compliance functions, medical functions, and marketing functions.
Welcome to the Pantrium podcast. Here, there's no fluff and no sales pitches, just real conversations. I'm your host, Kristensen, and at Pantrium, we bring together bold and curious founders and leaders to share their stories, their lessons they have learned, and the hard truth behind their success. We are all about challenging the status quo and explore fresh perspectives while focusing on what really matters: people. If you're craving deeper conversations, you're in the right space. So let's dive in. Jens, thank you so much for joining the Pantrium podcast. I have been looking forward to this dialogue. One of the first things that I ask people leading into these dialogues are around their fun fact. So by all means, please share your fun fact.
Thanks, Christie, and many thanks for the invitation. That's a big honor. Maybe something that's a little bit fun about me is that I have a strong allergy towards bad metaphors, and especially sports metaphors. So I can really lose attention and become a little bit of an angry old man when people speak too much in sports metaphors.
Are you just a hater of sports or just...
I'm not a sports fan, but I'm not a hater, definitely. But it's just the sports metaphors because they are so used and overused all over the place. And I really love good metaphors, and there are so many to be used. So, yeah.
And can you tell, are there a metaphor or a phrase that you really enjoy when you're saying there's good metaphors out there?
I tend to like more food or cooking metaphors. Some of the things we are also going to talk about today is top of funnel and how to attract new customers. It has a nice abbreviation with tofu. And you can make a lot of fun metaphors about tofu because everybody has sort of an understanding what it is, and a lot of people dislike it because it can be really boring, but you can also spice it up so it becomes really nice and tasty, and that's the same thing as top funnel marketing.
So let's just dive in. The first thing I want to know about is your career, your journey, and understand a little bit about the challenges you have overcome and how you did that. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can definitely do so. So by background, I'm a medical doctor. And I've worked in hospitals, in primary care, and in academia. And then I joined Novo Nordisk Denmark 7 years ago, where I started in a medical affairs function, so being sort of the medical subject matter experts on different cases. And this job slowly transitioned into being more unbranded or cross-branded or above-branded or what you will call it. And especially I was interested in education, where Novo Nordisk designed and provided education offerings to doctors and nurses in Denmark. It was a bit unstructured and lived everywhere, nowhere in the organization. And then after some time, a team was established and I was asked to head that up. So I did that for 3 years. And then recently we created a new team, a customer experience team, that also encompasses some other functions like commercial excellence and multi-channel marketing that I was also asked to head up. So I've transitioned from being very geeky medical into now a much more commercial partner for the organization, I believe. And I think this is also reflected in my personal development as well, because when you are a medical doctor and when you are in research, you work individualistic. And when you are in medicine, sometimes, of course, you always talk to the patient and ask for their perspective, but oftentimes there's not so much of a choice. I think coming from a role where you have a lot of knowledge, a lot of authority, a lot of decision power in individual cases, to joining a big corporation where you have very little autonomy, basically, has been challenging me quite a bit during my 7.5 years. I'm a bit impatient as a person as well, so that can often be challenging as well.
And how do you overcome that? Because as you said, it's very different to sit in front of a patient and have that authority to then now be perhaps more of a team player per se, but at least be part of many. How have you overcome that?
I think it comes down to two things. So first thing being sort of a revelation or recognition that other people are usually not as far in a thought process as you are yourself. I don't know if any of you are acquainted with a fun game called Drummers and Listeners or Tappers and Listeners, where the one who is at the center has to think of a commonly known song, and then they need to tap it on the table. Duck, 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 duck would be happy birthday to you. And then the listeners need to guess it. And everybody who's in the hot seat and does the tapping are always extremely confident of how many will be able to guess their thinking here and guessing the song. They usually say around 80 to 90%. And in the real world, it's actually the opposite. It's around 10%. And I think it gives a really good, I think it's super illustrative of your own thoughts are usually a different place than everybody else's. And in this setting, it's actually super important. So that has been one thing. And then the next thing, which is, I guess, more actionable, is always to put the customer in the center. That might seem like something you've heard a gazillion times before. But for me, it is really coming to that conclusion very explicitly has really helped me in many cases that so if I can direct the attention to what's in it for the customer and what's in it in the end for the patient, why does it lead to better patient treatment? That's what we do in our company. But on the other hand, if you're not able yourself to tell what does it do for the customer, the healthcare professional or the patient, then why would we do it?
When you say looking into and understanding the customer, how have you seen that your own being in the field experience have benefited your, if we should put it bluntly, like your office work?
I guess it's actually my claim to fame in my current job, because I don't know anything about customer experience or how to design or run a web page or make anything work in email marketing or stuff like that. So I'm definitely not a subject matter expert in customer experience, but I have a very deep understanding and knowledge about our customers in the end. I think that's imperative for me to be able to succeed in my role.
Wouldn't that not be categorized as customer experience because you truly understand the customer?
Well, I agree. I wouldn't have gotten the job anyways, but I think it's a little bit atypical in this position not to have a background in, for example, online marketing or something in that direction.
And how do you see that actually benefit the teams, that you have a different background, you come with a different perspective than the rest of the team?
I think it's general to the pharmaceutical industry that we are pretty stoked about how interesting we are ourselves as companies. And we all think we have the best products in the world, and some of us definitely have. But we think we are super interesting and that everybody wants to listen to us all the time. And being able to say, well, it's maybe not the case. Maybe doctors and nurses spend actually some of their working time not thinking of Novo Nordisk or any other pharmaceutical company, but actually has a job to get done. Because then we can provide a bidirectional value for these customers and play ourselves relevant and interesting.
And tell me a little bit more about, as you joined Novo Nordisk, what was the biggest challenges and how did you overcome them?
When you are a medical doctor, you spend quite a few years, both before you join university and during university and when you work as a doctor, on building a certain identity and self-picture. And that changes when you switch industry. I have spent some time thinking, so what is the new me? Can I still identify myself as a medical doctor? Do I need to identify myself as something else? And maybe most importantly, is it important? Is it important how I identify myself? If I can still see that I provide some value for the patients and the physicians in the end. I think that might be the most important part. And then obviously there are some things where you need to change your mindset a bit when you come from academia, especially. You are extremely detail oriented and you are always searching for the holes in the cheese. So if there is a comma that should be a period or a semicolon, then you have to point it out because that is the academic tradition. And when you join Pharma, you have to acknowledge that perfectionism is a productivity killer. And you simply don't get anything done if you nitty-gritty whichever detail. So you really need to lift your gaze and see, so what is important here? What is providing value? What can be a risk if we overlook this? And it's a bit difficult because pharma is and needs to be very obsessed with details, because we cannot put products on the market that are not investigated into every little single detail. There must not be a decimal or a fraction that is imprecise or incorrect. The same thing goes for the production. We cannot accept the slightest, smallest deviation in product quality, because in the end, that could be harmful for our patients, which we don't want. So that's also one part of the organization that is extremely and has to be extremely obsessed with quality. And then on the other part, when you join an affiliate, which is basically a marketing company, then you need to work much less with details, I have to say, and you need to put that perfectionism aside. And that can be an arena of conflict at times.
So can you give us an example where that conflict has appeared?
So in the team I'm now, we try to work very customer-centric. So we actually go out and interview our customers. What are their pain points? What can we gain by collaborating? How can we help them in their day-to-day work with their patients? I should maybe qualify or clarify that when I say customers, that's doctors and nurses in Denmark. So we interview them and work together with them on creating these tools, for example, to identify a care need for patients. So how often do they need to go to checkups for example, type 2 diabetes? And what should be in those checkups? What should they do? What should they talk about? Because we're entering territory that is a little bit unknown because nobody did it before, then there are many uncertainties. There are some gray areas where we move back and forth in, and that can be uncomfortable for different parts of the organization. I'd say the most classic of all conflicts in this kind of organization is between compliance functions, medical functions, and marketing functions, for example. And there you can really have a conflict about, okay, is this detail really important or is it not really important? Is there risk? Is there a small risk? Is there no risk?
I see there's a lot of synergies as well when you talk about compliance and risk assessments and so on with the financial world.
Yeah.
When you're saying about, the mindset and also the diversity in your team, and also understanding the people that they collaborate with across the organization, as well as understanding their customer, as you pointed out, the doctors and nurses. What are you looking for when you are building your teams?
In my new team, I've also had the privilege of needing to hire a few people from outside. And an expression that really has carved itself into my mind is a scout mindset, which I value extremely highly. Having a scout mentality, a scout mindset, is that you are extremely curious. You looking towards a common goal, a common best. You are willing to take on different approaches to solving a problem, using tools and skills you have learned in a different context, putting them into place in a new context, with sometimes what you have at hand that might not look sufficient, but always with an end goal of creating something for the greater good. I really appreciate this kind of scout mindset. The opposite, which is called soldier mindset, is when you really, that's also when you have a rhetoric about must-win battles, and you give your people titles as officers and lieutenants and all that war jargon. And I'm much more into the scout mentality.
To just wrap up this part, and I wanted to hear your advice for others that are either looking to hire with this idea of the mentality. What would your advice for them be?
I will say curiosity. Being extremely curious about your customers, their needs, their preferences, what they want, what are their allergies in a metaphoric understanding, what gets them going, what takes them off, and be really willing to have your assumptions challenged, identifying or adopting an outside-in perspective instead of going inside out, or even worse, inside in. That would be my advice, because if you want to create customer experience, you need to involve your customers a lot.
And speaking of customers, what would you say is some of your processes, frameworks, when you look at thinking about putting yourself in the customer's shoes and figuring out what to do, what to speak to your team about delivering to serve them in the best possible way?
As a rule in the team, involve customers early. So when we even start ideating about a problem, we interview customers. Is this really a problem? What is the actual problem? And try to go a little bit deep into the actual problem. Are we only solving something for ourselves, or are we also solving something for the customer? And this sounds fundamental, but I see it done not so often as we want to, being courageous enough to actually listen to the feedback. So if you ask them, is this a good idea? And they say no, then you should probably reevaluate and not just say, we probably asked the wrong customer, or we asked it in a wrong way, or something in that direction. You should actually, if you want to involve the customers, then do it for real, not pseudo involvement. And be honest and transparent when you present it to the customers. Don't put too much cream on top. It needs to be pretty raw and authentic when you communicate it to the customers. And my experience is, first of all, your end product gets much better, incomparably better. But also the customers really value it, because you show a side of yourself and of your company that's different from what they see all the time. So they get to see a different picture, but actually being vulnerable to the customers and say, hey, we actually want your advice here. They respond really good. I can give an example. So when I was in my previous role, we designed a new education program 1 year at a time, so an annual wheel. And we did that in sort of a design thinking sprint, where we involved customers both very early and a little bit later, and then again late in the process. The first thing we did was that we sent out a survey to the recipients of our email newsletter. We have around 2,000 or so recipients, where we asked them, hey, we really want your help to create the best education program for next year. So will you please answer, I think it was 3 short questions in a survey to help us improve. And the questions were, what are topics that are difficult or interesting or important? And then we asked them, what formats do you prefer? And I don't remember the third question. There might only have been 2, but still it was a pretty simple task, and it took like 2-3 minutes for most people. And we actually had around 150 that answered this survey. So around 8% of all the recipients for this email took the time to answer a survey. And the cool thing was that we got a lot of good ideas that we could then implement. Then we could test it again with focus groups of customers. Say, hey, what do you feel about that? But then we could also use it in our marketing efforts afterwards, because then we could have a headline and say, hey, we asked, you delivered, or you asked, we delivered. So you asked for something about this and that, and look, this is actually in the program now. And we could see a very good response to that in the market. So yeah, that would be one example of customer involvement from A to Z. The customer experience at these education meetings. So we aim for an NPS around 90, which is extremely high. Rolls-Royce users have an NPS of 45. So we are rather ambitious. Net Promoter Score, it's a term that basically describes how likely are you to recommend this activity to a peer. So we wanted an NPS around 90, and from the first meetings we have the meetings conceptualized. So we do the same meeting like 10 times over a year. And for the first meetings, we saw that the NPS was a bit lower than we expected. And then we could read from the feedback surveys that there were a few tweaks we could do, which we did. And we talked to our external speakers about it and gave them a few advice. And then we could actually see quite visible increases in the Net Promoter Score subsequently. So I would say I think we have in this process of designing education offerings, executing them, we have at least 4 customer involvement touch points, which has made us market leaders in this space.
And I think it's so important to just highlight also that element of working with your customers, right? And actually bringing them on to co-create. I think that's a very, very smart move. I'm curious, what was the biggest surprise or unexpected kind of happening through this experience?
I think there were some concrete actions we took that we wouldn't have taken it if it wasn't for the customer feedback. So I can say that in pharma in general, I believe, but at least we do have a challenge of engaging the Generation Y. They are flooding the what's called doctors now. So we have very huge generation baby boomer that are leaving the labor force now, and Generation Y is entering. And bear in mind that doctors are rather old when they enter the stage where they are interesting for the pharma companies. They are between 35 and 45 years. And Generation Y have fundamentally different preferences and needs than baby boomer generation. And we had a hard time engaging them. And we had some assumptions of what would they want. And we have previously had some feedback that, okay, this generation don't want to spend time outside working hours. So in the first place, we designed an education concept that was a one-day meeting. But then we saw that they showed up late and they left early because they needed to deliver or pick up children. But then we asked them, and they said, hey, we would actually really enjoy a meeting that was 2 days with an overnight stay, because then we can actually completely sort of, it's difficult for me to find the word here, sort of leave the family. So we don't have to like feel that we need to be present 2 times at once. Because if I'm in a meeting that is 2 full days, and I know that, then I won't be offering to pick up the children, for example. And that concrete feedback we implemented and had much better success rates with these kind of customers.
That's really interesting because it's more engaging. And as you said, you get them to really focus on being present and not worrying about their other chores that they have.
Yeah, the familiar duties, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also a much more expensive way of doing it. So just as a follow-up question, I wonder, does that then also influence the amount of times that those educational trainings would happen? Because bringing people together over 2 days with an overnight stay is more expensive than bringing them into the office or to a location for 2 hours.
True, really true. We do both actually, because there are still a lot of people who don't want to invest 2 full days of work. I think we took the decision of having quite a big investment in this source because it is extremely effective top of funnel marketing. I can say that when we did this course, we also started marketed or doing advertisement much more suited for the Generation Y. So we actually went from, usually we advertised in printed magazines. That was the way of doing it. It sounds old-fashioned, and it might be. But then we started advertising for these events on Instagram and a little bit Facebook and not LinkedIn, because young doctors do not use LinkedIn, basically. And we actually, the first year we did this, we had 3 or 4 meetings with a total of 100 participants. 60 of those we haven't had engagements with before. So 60% of the attendees were basically new to Novo Nordisk as customers, which I believe is a super high attraction rate. And we were able to have follow-ups with these customers subsequently with our sales teams.
That's really fascinating. I would say 60 is definitely very healthy. I think that it brings up the concept of understanding where your customers are as well. When you're saying the principle of, you went on perhaps the more traditional print advertising way, and then for this audience, you moved into Instagram. Was that also something you got feedback from your customers that that's where they are? Or how did you identify that switch? Because from perhaps a traditional structure and in pharma, Instagram would probably not be necessarily on the top even 10 social media or media outlets you would have thought about.
I think what brought us there was sort of a sudden understanding, which should come as a surprise, but it might come, that doctors are actually also human beings. And most of the time they act as human beings, and they actually have a life outside the clinic. So they consume media like everybody else. So we wanted to target them when they were not wearing the lab coat, to speak in metaphors again. We want to grab their attention when they were outside work, because when they are at work, they are so busy and occupied all the time. They see 30 patients a day, answer to 30 consultations and calls, questions from the staff and all that. So they are so occupied during the day. So we decided instead to target them when they were in their private time, which was, I think, the big change here.
It's very interesting because it sparks the question if there is, or has ever been, a difference between what's called kind of the corporate B2B marketing versus the consumer B2C marketing. Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah. I think it's a very good question, because as it is in Denmark and most other European countries, you are not allowed as a pharma company to advertise for the public. So everything goes through the healthcare professionals. They are your customers, but they are not the users of your product. It is actually an interesting distinguishment between B2B or B2C approaches.
Interesting. I like that.
I'd say, I also think we learned by this Instagram campaign thing that even though we are very regulated, and I believe that people, you mentioned finance before, if they know everything about this, we are very regulated, we are a very conservative industry, then we can still be a little bit fresh. We don't need to be as corporate. I think, as I also mentioned previously, that stripping off the extremely polished corporate facade that we have resonates very well with this type of people from Generation Y. And I think if Generation Y has been a slight disruption, then Generation Z will be a complete game changer.
I think it's going to be very interesting how organizations in all shapes and forms need to perhaps loosen up a bit in the sense of being more human, perhaps, because that's where you see also things are moving, that people don't want to hear from a corporate. They want to hear from a person that they trust. I wonder if you could share, because beyond pharma and the financial industry, which are just two examples of very highly regulated kind of industries and sectors, I wonder if you could share a bit of a top tip lessons or advice you would give listeners for when they're looking at being more focused on customers and bringing that into their decision making.
It's a really difficult question. I think it comes back to the point of involving the customer, actually asking them with a true intent of listening, and be vulnerable, be open when you talk to them, because if you are not, they will look right through you and then they won't do it again, or they will give you the answers that they expect, you expect. And that's actually something we see. So I read a tons of very good reports and white papers, etc., from big consultancy companies, etc., that are going out and asking physicians, so what do you need? What do you want? And they all say, hey, I want scientific papers, and I want the newest data, and I want data on file, and I want the nitty-gritty details, and that. And what happens if you put that on your web portal? Nothing at all. They don't consume it at all. But if you put short instructional videos, so what are you doing when you're sitting in front of your patient in this situation? What do you do, X, Y, Z? Then they consume that sort of content, which is completely the opposite of what they actually answer when you ask them.
I think that's a really interesting point. And I want to understand, what is a smart question to you? How do you create smart questions?
I don't really know if I'm particularly good at creating smart questions, but I think I'm good at creating rapport with these customers. I think that's more important. And I think it's very important to not make it about me when we talk. And personally, I prefer a much less structured way of interviewing people. I like to have it more of a conversation style. I obviously have some goals in the back of my head, but I don't use a script. And if the conversation deviates in another direction, I tend to see it as a sign of what is actually important to the person in front of me. And I think this has helped me a lot because I've been giving the feedback that I'm a person that's easy to trust and also entrust with insights.
I have probably a personal question, because I have been thinking a lot about active listening and really train myself to put myself into a space of active listening. And it can actually be really tiring. I'm curious, from when you interview your customers and when you are, in the moment and actively listening and letting the conversation kind of lead you in a direction, do you have any tricks, or how do you stay active in your listening?
I think something that helps me, and that's a privilege I have, that I'm usually not the only person in the room. So usually we divide the roles so that I can concentrate on having the conversation, and then the other person is the one who is jotting down all the golden nuggets. I actually think that some of the new AI tools in all the different software that we use every day, Copilot, for example, to mention one, is pretty good at summing up important points. That might be able to help a lot of people to get this AI summary of conversations. But the other advice would be to have somebody else present that doesn't have a very big role other than capturing what you're talking about, because I really agree and recognize it's extremely demanding to both facilitate a conversation, create a safe space and rapport, and then being able to remember everything afterwards. That's likely more than you can ask of one person, I'd say.
Yeah. Thank God for
unless you're a super skilled and trained journalist or doesn't do anything else than that.
I think as we are wrapping up, I am curious to hear what you would love to see change in your industry.
I would love to see that we weren't so self-obsessed. I would really love to see that we weren't only talking about helping people, but actually doing it. And this is said with a lot of love built into it, because I do recognize that all pharmaceutical companies create medicines that changes lives. But at least when we are talking about ourselves, we should be much more curious about our recipients, what is resonating with them, not only what comes out of a corporate branding campaign or what else it could be. And then understanding that our business is very conservative. We have been riding a wave of customers who were baby boomers or older that we really understood, and we were really good at engaging them. Generation X is sort of the forgotten generation, but then Generation Y and next thing Generation Z, as I've also said a few times now, is going to fundamentally transform everything in this business. And if you don't understand that, then you're out of the game.
And staying on that point, where do you think the sector is in 5 years from now?
I hope we're better at meeting our customers at their terms. I hope we are much better at delivering content, insights, tools, help on top of our products, having patient support programs that actually helps, having product experiences for the prescribers that actually creates value so they can do it self-directed, self-guided, instead of necessarily having a sales rep helping them. The sales reps are and will still be super important for the success, but there also needs to be an alternative or a supplement to that. That, I think, is some of my key wishes.
And here at Pantrium, we love hearing people's fresh perspectives and being challenged. Who do you follow or lean to be inspired or challenged?
So my Danish background really comes into play here, but I think the two persons I listen the most to right now would be Morten Mønster, who is an expert in behavioral sciences. So basically how to make people do what you intend. Lots of tips and tricks there. And then the other person is called Bent Flyvbjerg, who is a Danish professor in mega projects. Everybody can learn from him on how to get stuff done. But then I also think I'm quite inspired by a lot of different stuff, a lot of different books and podcasts and so on, because I think it makes me understand people better in broad terms.
I love that. And as we are, I think as a closing question, who has made a big impression on you throughout your career?
So I started working the day after I turned 15, so that's almost 25 years ago. I've had the privilege of having many very good leaders throughout my career, but the one who made a lasting impression his name is Troels Munch Jensen. He also works with Novo Nordisk. He was my mentor, and afterwards he became my leader. And he really taught me to value textbook leadership, actually. I think leadership is a skill and a discipline that needs to be learned like everything else. And I think too many people go too easy about it. He really taught me about the importance of that. And then he's a wonderful person. He has fantastic principles about trust, openness, honesty that really drizzle down the teams he leads. So, yeah.
What does leadership mean to you?
I really enjoy being a leader, and I think a lot of leadership the same way I think about being a parent. It is about getting the best out of your people or your children, watch them grow, flourish, and also with the understanding that one day they will move out. My job is to prepare them the best to that day when they're not under my wings anymore.
That is a beautiful way to put it, and I think it's a perfect way to end this fantastic conversation. Jens, it has been a pleasure.
Likewise, Christie. Thanks for inviting me.
If this episode gave you something to think about, I'll be really grateful if you could share this with your LinkedIn network. And to make sure you don't miss out on any new episodes, simply follow Pantrium wherever you are listening or watching. And just a note, the opinions and views shared by our guests are entirely their own and don't necessarily represent the businesses they work for. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, bye for now.